In the gilded halls of the Third Reich power structure, amidst the bluster of Nazi fanatics and the obedient click of jackboots, moved a man of profound and dangerous contradiction. He was Admiral Wilhelm Franz Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency. A career naval officer with a deeply conservative and patriotic heart, Canaris was not a Nazi. He was a German nationalist who served the regime he increasingly distrusted and despised, becoming one of the most enigmatic and pivotal figures of the war, a spy chief who was, himself, a central node in the conspiracy against his Führer. To understand the gravity of his warning in March 1943, one must first understand the man and the labyrinthine organization he commanded. The Abwehr, whose name simply means defense, was a vast, sprawling apparatus responsible for espionage, counter-espionage, and sabotage across the globe. Its headquarters at 7276 Terpitzufer in Berlin was a world unto itself, a haven for a strange assortment of characters, brilliant intellectuals, rogue adventurers, dedicated anti-Nazis, and, inevitably, a few genuine Nazi loyalists. Canaris, a short, balding man who preferred to walk his Dachshunds to striding in military parades, masterfully played these factions against one another. He was known as the old man, with an inscrutable, often sad, expression, his motives hidden behind a cloud of cigarette smoke and Delphic utterances. Canaris's journey from loyal servant to active conspirator was a slow, moral awakening fueled by the escalating barbarism of the regime. He was horrified by the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, sickened by the Kristallnacht pogroms in 1938, and utterly opposed to the march toward a world war he believed Germany could not win. By the time the war began, his inner circle within the Abwehr had become the beating heart of the German resistance. His chief of staff, General Hans Oster, was a committed conspirator who worked tirelessly to sabotage the Nazi war effort from within. The methods of this silent conspiracy were as ingenious as they were treacherous. Canaris and Oster systematically manipulated the intelligence that reached Hitler and the high command. They downplayed the capabilities of Germany's enemies, exaggerated the strength of Allied defenses, and authored pessimistic reports designed to discourage aggressive action. When the Abwehr uncovered critical secrets, like the details of the Allied D-Day landings, Canaris would often ensure the information was delayed, muddled, or discredited before it could reach a level where it might alter the outcome. He traveled to neutral Spain and Switzerland, not only to conduct official Abwehr business but to make clandestine contact with Allied intelligence, sending out fragile, hopeful feelers for a negotiated peace, all while knowing the price of failure was a noose in Plötzensee prison. His modus operandi was one of subtlety and misdirection. He surrounded himself with an aura of mystery and incompetence, often playing the bumbling, confused old man to deflect the suspicions of the Gestapo and the SD, the Nazi Party's own intelligence service led by the ruthless Reinhard Heydrich. This feigned incompetence was a perfect shield. When an Abwehr operation failed, it could be written off as the Admiral's ineptitude, rather than his deliberate sabotage. He walked a razor's edge every day, trusting a small band of confidants, his office a sanctuary of dissent in the very heart of the totalitarian beast. This was the man who, in early 1943, was watching the tide of war turn irrevocably. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had just concluded, with the surrender of the German Sixth Army. In North Africa, the Axis forces were being squeezed into a final, desperate pocket in Tunisia. The undivided attention of the Allied world was now turning toward Fortress Europe. And from his unique vantage point, with access to global intelligence networks and economic assessments, Canaris saw a storm gathering that others in Berlin refused to see, a storm not just of men and ships, but of sheer, overwhelming industrial production. He understood that the war was no longer a contest of tactics or will, but of factories, raw materials, and manpower. While German industry, under the chaotic direction of Albert Speer, was straining to increase output under constant bombardment, the United States was achieving a level of production that defied German comprehension. Canaris's agents and his own analysis presented a terrifying picture, a nation that had harnessed its boundless resources and unparalleled industrial capacity to become what President Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. It was this clear-eyed, terrifying understanding that led him to the Wolf's Lair in March 1943, to deliver a warning so stark, so contrary to the Führer's worldview, that it would be met not with strategic calculation, but with venomous ridicule. The spy in the shadows was about to step into the light, for one final, futile attempt to reason with the abyss. While the Third Reich waged war with fanatical zeal and the operational genius of its general staff, a different kind of war machine was awakening across the Atlantic, one whose scale and output transcended traditional military understanding. This was the American arsenal, an industrial juggernaut born not from ideology, but from a unique combination of vast natural resources, unrivaled engineering prowess, and an economic system that could be retooled for mass production on a scale the world had never seen. By early 1943, this machine was hitting its devastating stride, and its most terrifying product was raining from the skies not in dozens or hundreds, but in thousands. To comprehend Admiral Canaris's desperate warning, one must first grasp the reality he was trying to convey. The United States was not just building an air force, it was industrializing air power itself. The foundation of this effort was raw, unimpeded production. Germany and Japan fought a war of conquest to secure resources. The United States fought the war with resources already within its borders or accessible through secure sea lanes. It had limitless oil from Texas and Oklahoma, mountains of iron ore from Minnesota, and coal from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Its factories were safe from bombardment, its workers free from the threat of aerial annihilation. This security allowed for a continuous, 24-hour-a-day production cycle that its enemies could only dream of. The heart of this aerial armada was not a single, wonder weapon, but the relentless, assembly-line production of proven, effective designs. The numbers are still staggering to contemplate. At the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a factory so vast a reporter famously quipped you could see the curvature of the earth from one end, a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber was rolling off the line every 63 minutes. This single plant would eventually produce over 8,600 of these four-engine bombers, a figure that eclipsed the entire German production of all four-engine aircraft for the entire war. Similarly, the Boeing plant in Seattle, the Consolidated plant in San Diego, and others churned out B-17 flying fortresses with a similar, relentless rhythm. But the bombers were only part of the story. They needed escorts. And so, at the Republic Aviation plant in Farmingdale, New York, the P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, rugged fighter, was being produced by the thousands. At North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, the iconic P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would ultimately win the daylight air war over Europe, was beginning its own mass production journey. Alongside these, tens of thousands of training aircraft, transport planes like the C-47 Skytrain, and naval aircraft poured forth from hundreds of factories across the nation. This was not merely a matter of building airframes. It was about arming them, equipping them, and, most importantly, training the men to fly them. The United States established a pilot training program so vast it was akin to a university system for aviators. Civilian flight instructors, using civilian aircraft, taught the initial skills to hundreds of thousands of young men. They then moved on to a network of specialized schools for advanced training in bombers, fighters, and transports. The Tuskegee Airmen, despite facing segregation and prejudice, were proving their elite capabilities as part of this unprecedented expansion. The system was designed to produce not just planes, but complete, combat-ready air crews in numbers that would swamp the enemy. The logistical tale of this force was itself a monumental achievement. Every B-17 required thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, tons of bombs, and vast quantities of high-octane aviation fuel. The supply chain stretched from the mines and oil fields, to the refineries and factories, to the ports of embarkation on the east and west coasts, where ships waited to carry this material across the U-boat-infested oceans to Britain, North Africa, and the Pacific. This was the terrifying reality that Canaris's intelligence apparatus had pieced together. It was not a speculative forecast, it was a current inventory. By March 1943, the United States Army Air Forces already possessed tens of thousands of aircraft. The projection of 50,000 more was not an exaggeration, it was a conservative estimate of the annual output that American industry was demonstrably capable of achieving. This number represented a force that could, in theory, replace its entire combat losses several times over and still grow. Yet, In the delusional echo chamber of the Führer bunker, this information was dismissed as propaganda or sheer impossibility. Hitler and his inner circle, particularly the sycophantic Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, clung to a belief in German qualitative superiority and Aryan will. They believed a single German Tiger tank was worth 10 Shermans, and by extension, that the skill of a German pilot could overcome a numerical disadvantage of 10 to 1. They failed to understand that the American approach was one of overwhelming quantity, and that this quantity, when applied with strategic purpose, would achieve a devastating qualitative effect of its own. They were preparing for a duel of nights, while the United States was building a factory to produce crossbows that could darken the sun. Canaris saw the blueprints for that factory. He tried to sound the alarm, only to be told he was a fool for believing in the impossible. The setting was one of paranoid isolation and concrete gloom, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters in East Prussia. By March 1943, the atmosphere within the compound was a toxic brew of denial, blame, and simmering rage. The disaster at Stalingrad was a fresh, festering wound on the collective psyche of the German High Command. It was in this tense, claustrophobic environment that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the chief of the Abwehr, arrived to deliver his regular intelligence briefing. He carried with him an assessment so stark, so fundamentally at odds with the Führer's own worldview, that it was destined to provoke a firestorm. The meeting likely took place in the map room, surrounded by charts that told a story of shrinking gains and stretched frontiers. Canaris, a man who had long mastered the art of presenting disturbing news with a calm, almost detached demeanor, laid out the situation. He began with the broader economic picture, detailing the relentless mobilization of the American economy. He spoke of steel production, of automobile factories converted to tank production, of shipyards launching Liberty ships in a matter of days. He presented this not as speculation, but as hard data gathered by his agents from neutral capitals and through economic analysis. Then, he came to the core of his warning: American air power. He presented the Führer with the figures. The United States, he explained, was not merely increasing its air force, it was achieving a level of production that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. The goal, he stated with deliberate clarity, was not just to match the Luftwaffe, but to overwhelm it through sheer mass. He delivered the number that would define the encounter. Within the coming year, American industry was capable of producing and deploying 50,000 aircraft. The number hung in the air, a numerical abstraction that represented an unimaginable reality. 50,000 aircraft meant a sky perpetually darkened by Allied bombers and their fighter escorts. It meant that for every German plane shot down, 10 would take its place. It meant the systematic demolition of the German industrial base and the final, absolute loss of the air war. Canaris presented this not as a possibility, but as an impending, mathematical certainty. His intention was likely twofold: to shock Hitler into a realistic appraisal of the strategic situation and to push him toward considering a negotiated end to a war Germany could no longer win through arms. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. Adolf Hitler did not engage with the data. He did not question the sources or debate the methodology. He erupted. To the Führer, a man who believed in the primacy of will over matter, such numbers were not just wrong, they were heretical. They represented a cowardly, materialistic worldview that denied the power of the German spirit. He turned on Canaris with contempt. Eyewitness accounts from other officers present described the scene: the Führer's face flushing with anger, his finger jabbing the air, his voice rising to a shrill, furious pitch. He accused Canaris of being a defeatist, of being duped by Allied propaganda, of suffering from a failure of nerve. The most stinging insult, the one that would have been carefully recorded and whispered through the corridors of power, was his dismissal of the admiral's intelligence. "Fool!" Hitler screamed, or words to that effect. "You are a fool, Canaris. You believe these Jewish lies." The accusation of being a fool, Narr in German, was deeply significant. In the toxic hierarchy of the Third Reich, it was not just a personal insult, it was a political and ideological condemnation. It marked Canaris as someone whose judgment was unsound, whose loyalty to the Nazi cause was questionable, and who was fundamentally incapable of grasping the revolutionary power of National Socialist will. It was a verdict that placed him outside the circle of trusted confidants and squarely in the crosshairs of the Gestapo. For Canaris, the moment was a chilling confirmation of his worst fears. It was not merely that his warning was rejected, it was that the mechanism for rational decision-making had been utterly destroyed. The Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, had evolved into a cult of personality where unpleasant facts were treated as personal disloyalty. The meeting ended not with a new strategy, but with a reinforced delusion. Hitler, having shouted down the bearer of bad news, could retreat further into his fantasy where the sheer force of his will could bend reality itself. For Canaris, the personal and professional risk was now immense. The public humiliation and their fool label effectively neutered his remaining influence. He returned to Berlin to the Terpitzufer, to the labyrinth of the Abwehr, a marked man. The encounter had sealed his fate as much as it had sealed the fate of the Reich he tried to save from itself. The fateful warning had been delivered and rejected. The door to reason had been slammed shut, and the path to ruin was now wide open. The skies over Europe would soon bear witness to the truth of the fool's prophecy. The explosive confrontation at the Wolf's Lair was more than a mere disagreement, it was the ultimate collision between two irreconcilable realities. On one side stood the empirical, analytical world of intelligence, grounded in data, logistics, and cold, hard fact. On the other stood the ideological, solipsistic world of Adolf Hitler, governed by faith, will, and racial destiny. The rejection of Canaris's warning about American air power was not an isolated error in judgment. It was the definitive example of how a totalitarian system, built on a foundation of delusion, systematically overruled its own intelligence apparatus, leading the nation to catastrophe. The core of the delusion was the Nazi concept of Willensvollstreckung, the execution of will. Hitler and his inner circle, particularly the sycophantic Hermann Göring, genuinely believed that the strength of National Socialist conviction could overcome material disadvantages. A German soldier, imbued with this spirit, was worth 10 of his enemies. A German engineer, inspired by the Führer, could achieve miracles of production. This belief system created an impenetrable filter through which all intelligence had to pass. Information that reinforced this worldview was accepted and celebrated. Information that challenged it, like the prospect of 50,000 American planes, was dismissed as the product of enemy deception, capitalist cowardice, or, as in Canaris's case, the personal failure of the messenger. This cognitive dissonance was weaponized by the structure of the Nazi state. Hitler had deliberately created a system of overlapping responsibilities and competing fiefdoms, a practice known as divide and rule. The Abwehr, the traditional military intelligence service under Canaris, was in a constant, bitter rivalry with the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the Nazi Party's intelligence agency under the ruthless Reinhard Heydrich and later Ernst Kaltenbrunner. The SD, fiercely loyal to the party ideology, often produced reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. They downplayed Allied capabilities and exaggerated German victories. When Canaris presented his bleak assessments, he was not just presenting data, he was engaging in a bureaucratic war where his opponents could easily label him a defeatist. His fool verdict was the ultimate victory for the SD. Göring's role in this tragedy was particularly pivotal. As the commander of the Luftwaffe and the head of the German four-year plan for economic mobilization, he was directly responsible for both understanding the Allied threat and matching it. Yet, Göring was hopelessly out of touch, a slave to his own vanity and opiate addiction. He had staked his reputation on the invincibility of the Luftwaffe, famously boasting that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Reich. To admit that American industry could produce 50,000 planes was to admit his own professional and personal failure. Consequently, he became the chief architect of the delusion within the inner circle, dismissing Canaris's figures as insane fantasy and reassuring Hitler that the Luftwaffe, with its qualitatively superior aircraft and pilots, would always prevail. Göring's self-interest became a key filter that blocked accurate intelligence from reaching the Führer. The rejection of the 50,000 plane prophecy also stemmed from a fundamental inability to comprehend American capitalism and democracy. The Nazi leadership viewed the United States as a weak, decadent, and racially fractured nation, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for total war. They believed that its industrial output was hollow, its people soft, and its political system too chaotic to sustain a prolonged military effort. The idea that this mongrel society could outproduce the disciplined, technologically advanced Third Reich was not just wrong, it was an ideological impossibility. Their racism and ideological arrogance blinded them to the awesome power of a free, industrialized society unified by a common cause. In the aftermath of the March 1943 meeting, the consequences were immediate and chilling for the German war effort. Canaris was effectively sidelined. His intelligence was increasingly ignored, and his access to Hitler became limited. The Abwehr, already under a cloud of suspicion for its failures and its chief's defeatism, was systematically dismantled and absorbed by the SD in early 1944. For the Allies, the German refusal to believe in their productive capacity was a strategic gift of incalculable value. It granted them a precious, uncontested period to build up their forces unmolested by a fundamental shift in German strategy. Their fool's prophecy thus stands as a timeless lesson in the perils of leadership that prioritizes ideology over information. Canaris was not the fool. The true folly was a system that celebrated yes men, that punished truth-tellers, and that believed its own propaganda so completely that it lost the ability to distinguish reality from fantasy. The delusion that overruled intelligence did not just lead to a lost battle, it guaranteed the systematic destruction of German cities, the immolation of its air force, and the eventual collapse of the front lines. The skies would soon fill with the silver wings Canaris had foretold, and the roar of their engines would be the sound of a prophecy, once mocked, becoming devastatingly real. The dismissal of Admiral Canaris's warning in March 1943 was not merely a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a strategic decision with catastrophic consequences. The following 2 years would see the relentless and systematic fulfillment of his fool's prophecy, as the skies over the Third Reich turned a shimmering, deadly silver. The legacy of the ignored warning was written in the firestorms of Hamburg, the crumbling wreckage of German factories, the annihilation of its oil supply, and the final, utter defeat of the Luftwaffe, a defeat orchestrated not by a single general, but by the relentless output of the very industrial juggernaut Hitler had refused to believe in. The first tangible signs of the coming storm appeared in the summer of 1943. While the German High Command remained fixated on the Eastern Front and the deteriorating situation in Italy, the Anglo-American air forces were building up their strength in Britain with methodical purpose. The combined bomber offensive, codenamed Operation Point Blank, began in earnest. Its goal was not just to damage German industry, but to dismantle the entire Luftwaffe, to clear the skies for the eventual invasion of Europe. The initial American belief in unescorted, daylight precision bombing was brutally tested and found wanting, leading to horrific losses like the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. But unlike the Germans, the Americans adapted. And they had the industrial depth to absorb their losses and innovate. The turning point, the moment when Canaris's 50,000 planes became an operational reality, was the arrival of the long-range escort fighter, most notably the P-51 Mustang. By the end of 1943, these fighters, produced in their thousands, began to accompany the bomber streams all the way to their targets deep inside Germany and back. The result was a massacre of the Luftwaffe's defensive fighter force. The experienced German pilots that Göring had vaunted were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The numerical superiority foretold by Canaris now achieved a qualitative effect: air superiority. By D-Day in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a ghost, unable to mount more than token resistance to the invasion armada or the thousands of aircraft supporting it. The strategic impact was apocalyptic for Germany. With air superiority established, the Silver Armadas could now methodically dismantle the Reich's ability to wage war. Their oil campaign became a primary focus. The synthetic fuel plants that Hitler's scientists had perfected, the very technology that had allowed Germany to circumvent a lack of natural oil, were systematically bombed into rubble. By the autumn of 1944, German fuel production was a fraction of its former self. Tanks and trucks sat idle for lack of fuel. Pilot training was slashed to a bare minimum, creating a vicious cycle where new pilots, with only a fraction of the flight hours of their Allied counterparts, were shot down on their first few missions. The mighty panzer divisions, the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, were immobilized. Simultaneously, the transportation network was shattered. Their Big Week bombing campaign of February 1944 had already crippled the German aircraft industry. Now, the focus shifted to marshalling yards, bridges, and canals. The movement of coal from the Ruhr to steel plants ground to a halt. The distribution of finished goods to the front lines became a logistical nightmare. Albert Spee's remarkable efforts to increase armaments production in 1943 and early 1944 were rendered null and void by the destruction of the transportation system that supplied his factories and delivered their products. The legacy of the ignored warning was also one of profound human suffering. For the German civilian population, the prophecy meant living in a state of perpetual terror. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Kassel were consumed in firestorms, their historic centers erased. Millions were made homeless. The constant wail of air raid sirens, the shudder of the ground under thousands of tons of high explosives, and the fear of incineration became the daily reality for those living in the heart of Fortress Europe. The very will of the people to continue the fight, which Hitler had believed was supreme, was broken not by enemy infantry, but by the endless streams of bombers that proved, night after day, the futility of their leadership's defiance. In the end, the sky turning silver was the ultimate vindication of rational analysis over ideological fanaticism. Canaris, who would be executed in a concentration camp in April 1945 for his role in the July 20 plot, did not live to see the final act. But his prophecy had been fulfilled to the letter. The 50,000 planes, a figure that was, if anything, an understatement, had not just flown, they had decided the war. They had reduced the Third Reich to rubble, starved its armies of the tools of war, and demonstrated with brutal finality that no amount of willpower can withstand the overwhelming force of industrial might married to a determined purpose. The legacy of March 1943 is a stark lesson. To ignore a warning of such magnitude is not to disprove it, but to become a passive agent in its terrifying fulfillment.